We're moving our way through Romans. We're getting near the end. There's 16 chapters, and we start chapter 15 today. So we'll do 15 today and next week. Then we'll take that break to do the missions things for a couple weeks, and then we'll come back and do chapter 16, and then we move into Advent. Pretty amazing, isn't it? We're moving right along here. All right. The first 7 verses of Romans 15 says, "We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Christ Jesus, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, welcome one another, as Christ has welcomed you, for the glory of God." When you hear that word welcome, what comes to mind? Just shout out a word. Welcome. I'm sorry? Friendly. What else? I can't hear it. What was that? Congeniality. Hospitality. Very good. I think of a door being opened, right? Welcome, welcome. A hug, a welcome, a handshake, somebody greeting. Welcome is our first step of building community, and hopefully we're not just welcoming somebody that we meet for the first time, but we welcome people over and over and over again to be a part of our lives. And that's what we are as the church. It's not just individual saints, individual people following Jesus, but God said, I want these people to come together so they can feel strengthened and encouraged and find unity in one voice in praising and worshiping the same God together. And that's part of why we gather together in what we call church. And we build community, and we try to be churches that are welcoming, and we've all experienced probably going into a church that didn't feel very welcoming. It wasn't very hospitable and friendly and congenial. I mean, we didn't feel that sometimes. But as a church, that should be one of our main characteristics, is that we are welcoming and we're open to receiving one another into our lives. Because Jesus was that welcoming type of guy. The Gospels give account after account of how Jesus welcomed people into his life. And he particularly leaned towards ordinary people, or people that were out on the fringes of society that were often neglected. And I'm really excited that starting with Advent, our new theme of the year is going to be the year of Jesus. That's what we're going to do next year. It's going to be our year of Jesus. And we're basically just going to go through the Gospels and just tell the story of Jesus from beginning to end. So we're going to start a little earlier than 2022 because it fits really well with the beginning of Jesus' life. But when we get to Advent next year, we're going to be talking about his death and resurrection. It'll be kind of a different Advent, but that's the reason he came, right? To give his life. And so we're going to follow that throughout the year, and I'm really excited about that. And I hope that we can learn more about Jesus and understand who he is and what he means to us. And when we worship him and when we try to follow him, that we'll do a better job at it as a result of that. But Jesus was a very welcoming type of person. And so when we think about this passage in Romans 15, everything that it says there is like what Jesus was like. And as Christians, we should be like Jesus, right? And so we want to be able to do that. And so, we of all people should be the most welcoming, loving people on the planet. That's what we should be, because we have the love of God in us. And if we have the love of God in us, that love should extend to the strangers. It should extend to the refugee. It should extend towards those that are being shut out of the rest of society, the ones that are neglected, the ones that are on the fringes. Our love should overcome any barriers that keep us from being able to extend our hands to them. And so that's what we need to be known for. And if we can't find it within ourselves sometimes to reach out to people, then we ask God, God, fill me with your love so that I can love those that's hard for me to love. Because it's not easy. It's not easy to love everybody that comes across our path. And when it says about, reaching out and loving our neighbor is anybody that crosses our path in life. That's our neighbor. Whoever's in close proximity with us is our neighbor, not necessarily the people that live in the house next to you. So we cross paths with a lot of people that we don't necessarily like or want to reach out and love, don't we? But we can do it with the love of Jesus that comes into us. Because Christ welcomed us, even as we had our own sins, our prejudices, our blind spots, our shortcomings, our stubbornness. And so when we come across other people that have their own sins or their own prejudices or their own blind spots or shortcomings or stubbornness, then we take on the love of Christ to welcome them as well. As I was preparing for this, I came across an article that I thought, wow, this is what I want to share with the church today, because it talks about the welcoming community. And what it was is this guy who is a scholar, his name is Robert Banks. He graduated from Cambridge. He's a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. And taking things we have from the Bible, from history, archaeology, from other things, he put together a narrative of what it was like to go to church in Rome in AD 60. The very people that we're talking about right here in the book of Romans. And he put together this he uses the names of people that were definitely, and when we get to chapter 16, we're going to see these names of people that are in the church. And so he kind of put together, of course, he has to put in some, a little bit of creativity and a little bit of fiction, but it was very much the issues they were dealing with and what a church service would have been like in that time. And so I'm going to read this story. I actually had to edit it because I had to make it half of what it really was. But I hope that we can think about, even though our setting for church is very different than it was in AD 60 in Rome, what are the things we can take from this? How can we use their example of what it means to be a welcoming body of believers and to be able to make that work in Arcola in 2021 today? So use your little creative imagination as you picture the things that's going on here as I tell the story of what church was like back then. And maybe, even though we're in a different situation, our church services don't look exactly like this. What are we missing? How can we make church more like this? I'll be honest, when I read this would be awesome. It'd be awesome to come to church and it'd be something like this. And so how can we make that happen? It's hard to do it in a room with a lot of people, but maybe there are ways that we could make church kind of like this, even in all the different things that we do. Anyway, just think about it, and we'll go from there. My name is Publius. I come from Philippi, a comparatively new colony in Macedonia, one I am proud to say is Roman through and through. I'm staying for a while with some old acquaintances of mine, Clement and Euodia in Rome. And earlier today, we all went out to dinner at a home nearby, and it was such a strange experience that I want to tell you about it. You see, my friends have a standing invitation from a Jewish couple called Aquila and Priscilla to join them every seventh day of the week for a meal. This includes visitors as well, so I didn't need a special invitation to attend. It was about mid-afternoon when we set out, well into the 9th hour of the day. And as we came up to the house, we could see the shop front was closed. On the door was a small sign with Aquila's name and his trade. On the door, and then Clement rapped at the door a few times. And it wasn't long before someone appeared. A rather slim, medium-sized man bustled toward us. I'd been told in advance that he was Jewish, but that didn't worry me. We Romans are tolerant in such matters, and I'd gotten along fairly well with other Jews, though I'd never been to a meal in one of their homes. They don't entertain foreigners much, something to do with their religious principles. They keep pretty much to themselves. Euodia had gone out of her way to assure me that I would not feel out of place if I came along. I was a little nervous, but curious all the same. When Aquila appeared, there was the usual kiss and the arm clasp between the men. "Welcome, welcome, welcome," said Aquila heartily. "God's favor and peace be with you." "And with you," returned Clement. "It's good to be here again." And this was really strange. Aquila also embraced Euodia and exchanged kisses with her, as if they were brother or sister or something. Then Priscilla came into the room, all dressed in a colorful but simply decorated woolen gown. "We're delighted you've come, Publius," said Priscilla. "Clement and Euodia told us you might come with them." Then after depositing our cloaks with them, we took off our sandals and put on the slippers that they provided. We also handed over a bunch of flowers and the contribution to the meal that Euodia had prepared for us to bring. Then we fell to talking. Aquila asked me in quite fluent Greek about the itinerary of my recent trip, the weather on the sea crossing from Achaia, and the length of my stay in the city. And just as I began to ask Aquila about his earlier days in Pontus, we were interrupted by the arrival of some other guest. Our large family, consisting of 4 children and an elderly grandmother who had been living with her son and his wife since the death of her husband. I was drawn into the conversation with that family who had just entered. This went on for quite some time until 2 more guests arrived, a rather distinguished-looking gentleman in an expensive-looking light robe and a companion in a simple tunic, who could well have been his servant. Despite the obvious differences in rank between them, I was surprised and a little shocked at the lack of discrimination shown by Aquila and his wife in greeting them. The children immediately detached themselves from us and surrounded the servant. "Lysias, Lysias," they called. He was obviously a favorite with the youngsters and looked equally delighted to see them. I was soon introduced to the servant's owner. Aristobulus was his name, and he held down a relatively responsible post in the public service. We talked about his work for a while, but had not gotten very far before Aquila clapped his hands and called for our attention. He said that he'd just received word that the other guests were on their way, so we might as well move into the dining room in readiness for the meal. I took the opportunity to rejoin Clement and Euodia as we proceeded out of the hall. "Is this when the meeting starts?" I asked Clement. He looked at me quizzically, a slight smile playing around the corners of his mouth. "It really began the moment we came into the house," he replied, and he left me to think about what that could mean. The dining room also ran off the main hall in which we'd been standing and was a quite generous size, and I could see why the meetings were held at their place. It would have been impossible to fit very many people in my friend's flat. The size of this dining room had been extended to accommodate 2 additional couches. This gave space for more than the usual 9 guests to recline on 3 couches, and space for the children on folding stools in the open space. As we entered, Priscilla directed us to our places. Would you recline at the top end of the middle couch around the first table, Publius?" she asked. I thought she must have been mistaken, for this was the place normally reserved for the most honored guest. "Here," I said, uncertain as I reached the position. She smiled and nodded, so I dutifully took my place. Beside me, she positioned Clement and Euodia, Aristobulus, who by right should have had my place. But he was placed to Euodia's left, along with his servant on the couch next to him. Usually, servants had to stand, not recline beside their masters during a meal, so I was surprised that Aristobulus did not seem to mind. On the head couch, Aquila took his proper place on my right, with Priscilla next to him. A few other guests now began to arrive. A Jewish weaver, his wife, and 2 daughters, greeted by one and all, joined the people at the other table. A few steps behind them were 2 free men. All these placed their gifts on the table alongside the food that our hostess had already laid there. "It's getting late," Aquila said, "so I think we should begin the meal. It looks as if Felix has been kept back by his master again, so there's no telling when he'll arrive. Would you make sure, Philologus, that some food is left for him? Otherwise, he'll probably miss out on the meal altogether. We all know what his master is like." Philologus nodded in agreement. And before we began to eat, however, Aquila sat up. He took a loaf of bread from the table before him, and he said he would like to give thanks. Some sort of offering to their god, I assumed. I'd heard that Jews did things differently, starting the meal by the breaking of a loaf with some sort of prayer. What happened next was more like him. Instead of offering the bread to his god, Aquila reminded the people present that their God had offered something for them, his only son, no less, who died that they might live. He went on to say, just before he sacrificed himself for us, he took part in a meal with his followers, just like the one we're having now. During the meal, he shared bread and told them that this represented him. And this is why he wants us to continue having meals together. And this is why we are meeting together today. This means, he continued, that although he isn't physically with us in the room, he is nevertheless really present among us. And as we eat together, beginning with this bread, which he was now breaking into substantial portions and passing among the guests, we'll experience him directly within ourselves, as well as through our fellowship with one another as we eat. He concluded all this with a brief prayer, if you could call it that, because it was made up on the spot with a brief, as far as I could tell, it was spoken in quite a normal voice. In it, he thanked his God for all of this and told him how much we looked forward to the meal and everything that went with it. He reclined again on the couch to a chorus of amens, and we began to eat. After we'd been eating for a little while, Aquila turned to the grandmother and asked her a question. How are you managing, Mary, in this hot weather we've been having? It's certainly unusual this time of year. Clement had already confided it to me. She only recently came down to Rome from the hill country in the far north, the original home of her entire family. But she's developed some sort of skin trouble that often causes her discomfort. She replied in a noticeably provincial dialect, very much better, thank you, Aquila, especially since last week when the whole group prayed for me. While this was in progress, we began our first course. It was a small portion of the wheat meal porridge that we normally eat in larger quantity as our main dish. It was garnished, this unusually, with a variety of relishes, mushrooms, olives, and other herbs, and also flavored with honey sweetening. This entree is extremely tasty, I commented to Euodia. The dishes and cups we were using were made of earthenware, not the bronze and silver tableware you see in the very best of homes, but my host did not seem to be embarrassed by the modesty of their utensils. Large spoons were provided for those remnants of the meal that our fingers couldn't handle. Also on the table were bowls of water and serviettes for washing the hands and cleaning the fingers before, during, and after the meal. Often the servants set to this with the help of sponges and even wine at times, but here it was a do-it-yourself arrangement. We had to keep the flies off ourselves too. The wine itself, mixed with water rather than honey, was of reasonable quality and delightfully cool to the palate. Euodia broke into the conversation. I received a letter from Fortunatus this week, she said, and he asked that his greetings be passed to everyone. Fortunatus had apparently spent a short time in Rome with my friends some months before. During that time, he had also attended the gatherings. He had moved back to Miletus and was deeply involved with other believers there. Euodia read a few paragraphs from the letter in which Fortunatus told of his latest doings. Well, please pass on our warmest greetings in return, said Aquila. Tell him that we'll continue to pray for his welfare. And several others nodded their agreement. When Priscilla returned moments later, I could scarcely believe my good fortune. I'd been hoping for a little meat. So rarely had I eaten any lately. It was always in short supply and horribly expensive. But here was a large plate of mixed meats for each table, and another with assorted vegetables. They must have been saving up all week for this, I thought. And to my embarrassment, I was again served first. Across from me, I was surprised to see Aristobulus place food on his servant's plate. Not only did he place it there, but he placed exactly the same kind and amount as he had on his own plate. Unbelievable. Suddenly, a young man, bearded rather than clean-shaven like most of us, appeared in the doorway. Welcome, Felix, said Aquila, motioning from his couch. Full of apologies, the servant explained why he had been delayed. My master sent me off on a wild goose chase across town, he said, and it's taken up the entire afternoon. Of course, said Aquila. We apologize for starting without you, but the evening was drawing on. Felix still hesitated at the door. Excuse me, Aquila, but would there be room for someone else at dinner as well? He beckoned with his hand an even younger man, also bearded, who stepped gingerly forward. This is Tyro, Felix continued, a friend of mine who you've heard me talk of before. I've spoken to him many times about the Lord, but last night when he was talking with Andronicus, the preacher who's in town at the moment, he suddenly knew that what he's heard from me is really true. And so he was baptized straight away in the Tiber River. And then he came straight after work to tell me what had happened. I felt sure you wouldn't mind if I brought him along. Aquila got up from his couch, went directly to the newcomer and embraced him. You're more than welcome here, he said, more than welcome. We'll make some extra room for you over here. It's going to be a bit of a squeeze, but that's nothing to worry about. Priscilla was already bringing in extra food from the kitchen. Then Philologus informed the gathering that his eldest girl had prepared a small contribution for the meeting and would now like to present it to them. There were muttered words of encouragement from all corners of the room as the little girl got up and moved to the wall so that she could see everybody. "It's a song," she said, "one I made up myself. It's about all the different sort of things that God had made." And then she sang quite confidently in a clear, true voice, and all clapped when she finished. Priscilla and the others, who had been waiting at the door, not wishing to interrupt, then brought in dessert. This contained a good choice of apples, grapes, pears, and figs. And after washing our fingers in the bowl and wiping on the serviettes to dry them, we each took our choice. I couldn't help but feel that from a religious point of view, the whole meeting left a lot to be desired. As far as I could tell, what had happened so far had contained scarcely anything religious at all. Why, they didn't have a priest or all the ritual trappings that you expect. And during this final course, I was able to talk to Aquila again and turn the conversation back to his time in Pontus. He spoke about his past experiences there and present contacts in the area, and he was able to answer many of the questions I put to him. But after a while, someone else claimed his attention, so I leaned across to talk to Aristobulus. It wasn't long before he launched into an account of how he'd become involved with this group. He'd experienced doubt for some time about the power of our traditional religion. Then, long impressed by the monotheistic emphasis of the Jews and their moral outlook, he crept into a synagogue one day and found a genuine alternative. But after meeting Aquila and Priscilla, he linked up with this gathering instead. And although his servant had been persuaded to join him, he failed to convince his wife that there was anything important to this. At this point, we were interrupted by Lysias, who at Aquila's signal had begun to refill the cups at our table, and Felix was doing the same at the other. I assumed this was for the usual time to honor our emperor that normally takes place at the end of the meal. Instead, Aquila took his cup in both hands and said, "The wine that we've been drinking has been part of our meal and to help us to fellowship in the Lord. But it means more than this. For as Jesus explained, it reminds us that he is the one who's created this bond through his death. It also stands as a promise to us of this fellowship that we will have one day with him when we sit down at his table and when we dine with him face to face. So as we drink this cup together, let us take these things to heart and be grateful for them, looking back with appreciation on the one and looking forward with anticipation to the other. And may our meetings express the oneness that we have with him more and more, so that they are, as it were, a little taste of heaven here on earth." In this spirit, they all drank. And I didn't know quite what to do and hoped no one would report to the authorities this breach of etiquette. I had my own problems with Nero, but failing to acknowledge him was going a step further than I had ever experienced. Priscilla checked the oil supply and the saucer-shaped earthenware lamps on the tables and made sure that the wicks were a reasonable length. Since dark was still a little way off, however, she did not light them immediately. Oil is too expensive to waste, as we are all aware. I began to wonder what would happen now that dinner was over. Normally, this time is taken up with some sort of entertainment, such as a musical interlude, the recitation of a classical poem, or a discourse on a moral topic, helped along, of course, with liberal servings of wine. But since our cups were being cleared away, I presumed we weren't going to have any more of the latter. When everyone had again seated themselves, Aquila bowed his head slightly and asked the Spirit of God to guide all that now took place. As before, he did this quite simply and matter-of-factly. After a short pause, he then suggested we sing a song, the one that the children particularly liked. The song had no sooner finished than Clement closed his eyes and began to talk to his God. Like Aquila, he spoke in a quite ordinary fashion, almost as if his God were a close acquaintance in the same room. While he was talking, there were occasional murmurs of agreement from others in the room. At the end, there was a loud affirmation from the whole group. The same pattern repeated itself as different people spoke, women as well as men, and even one of the children. Some of the conversations with the God were as long as Clement's, and some were just a few words. A very hesitant sentence or two came from Tyro, in which he thanked God that he now understood how much he had done for him, in particular the gift of his one and only son. At the end of this, the heads of each family present, and one or two of the others, they went across the room. They laid hands on Tyro, they welcomed him into their community, and they pledged him their future support. He was moved to tears by this and could scarcely express his gratitude to them. As they resumed their places, Hermas said that there was a psalm from the sacred writings he felt was particularly appropriate for the occasion. He must have had a good memory for this kind of thing, for the recitation lasted some minutes. "Would you like a copy of it?" he asked Tyro when he had finished. "I could easily write one out for you." Tyro nodded, still a little overwhelmed, I think, by what had happened earlier and all the attention he was receiving. During the slight pause that followed, Priscilla got up and lit the lamps. By now it was almost completely dark outside. We could hardly see one another across the room. While she was doing this, Hermas began to tell a story from the sacred Jewish writings about one of the great heroes of the past, David. From the way he talked, the group must have been hearing about a different part of David's life each time they met. Hermas certainly knew how to put across a story, I'll give him that, because I don't think there was one of us, adults or children, who made a sound while he was speaking. Another song followed, suggested this time by Aristobulus. Then everyone settled back as Aquila began to speak. He started out by saying to them that the Spirit of the God now gives gifts in greater numbers than ever before, so much so that everyone could receive one or more of them. He described the many ways their community could be of a help to one another and to others outside this group. Some gifts were about ways to talk about faith, and some gifts were ways to serve others in action. I was impressed by the genuine love that was spoken of when they said that they had seen the example through their God, Jesus, who lived and died, but get this, he lives again. He stressed the motivation of love so that all would know that this love of God was real. And he concluded with the direct challenge to all of us here. Our whole welfare, he pointed out gravely, both as individuals and as a group, depends on it. I noticed the youngest child of Philogus' family had fallen asleep in her mother's arms, and the other daughter was leaning half asleep against one of her brothers. All around the walls, gigantic shadows cast by our bodies contracted and expanded to the rhythm of the lights. The weaver's wife began to speak. As I was sitting here, she said, thinking about what Aquila was saying, I knew God wanted me to add something to it. God wants us to know that he will present us with even more things to share with one another, and that we will make the experience even more helpful to one another. This will not happen if we serve ourselves. If we're willing to do this, we will also find more scope for using our gifts outside of this group and others that we want to influence for the Lord. She stopped, and as you can imagine, given the previous discussion, the general response to this was very positive indeed. After a slight pause, Hermas stood up and walked across to Mary, the grandmother. Standing beside her, he placed his hands on her head and called out for the others to pray with him for her. He then claimed on behalf of God's power to heal, thanking him for the improvement that had taken place during the last week and asking that this might continue until she was fully well. This seemed to be a cue for a whole assortment of prayers by different members of the group for various aspects of each other's lives. I was starting to grow sleepy as this went on, but eventually Aquila brought things to an end by suggesting that we sing together a little farewell song that everyone knew. We did so, and the meeting was over. Well, perhaps not quite, for I remembered what Clement had said to me earlier about when it actually began. Philogus and his wife immediately bade good night to their hosts and went out with their children. Priscilla accompanied them to the door. The second family excused their withdrawal by referring to the lateness of the hour, and they also made their farewells. Both groups came across to me on their way out. They wished me a happy stay in Rome, and one of them even invited me to an evening meal the following week. I accepted. The remainder stayed on, talking in small groups, and on her return, Priscilla offered them some more wine. I noticed Aristobulus discussing with Hermas in one corner of the room and confidentially giving him some money, overriding the other's protests as he did so. The two servants also said goodbye, and Aquila conducted them through the hall to the main door. We decided to take our leave as well and followed them out into the hall. Ahead of us, Priscilla had halted the two servants just as they were about to leave and pressed two serviettes full of leftovers into their hands. They left, and we began to make our own farewells. I thanked our host most warmly for including me in their invitation, and they made it clear to me that I was welcome to come with Clement and Euodia any time during my stay in Rome. After receiving our sandals, everyone exchanged kisses goodbye. Aquila and Priscilla commended them to the grace of God as they did so. Then we collected our cloaks, threw them over our shoulders, and went out into the night. That was church in Rome in AD 60. You feel like you were there with them today? We have a bond. We have a bond together.